So I guess I don't need an introduction because a lot of y'all were in the last session, but I'm Gina Garcia, Dr. Gina Garcia, and I'm from the University of Pittsburgh. And I primarily spend my whole life in being, well, not my whole life in being, but my whole research life in being thinking about Hispanic serving institutions and what it means to be an HSI. So that's what I think about a lot, and starting to get a lot of invitations to HSIs to help folks think about it, right? Because that's where HSIs are at. It's like, well, what does it mean and how do we become it, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to do a lot of little small activities where you just think, right? A lot of thinking, and really in the thinking and the activities, it's thinking about like, what are we doing? I want you to think about what are you doing, like your own self-assessment of your campus. Because I can do a quick, assessment based on like your websites, but the websites don't tell everything, right? Like it doesn't reveal a lot of things that you all know because you're here, right? So I'm gonna have you all do some of that and get y'all talking about that, right? That like, where are we doing this stuff? Where are we doing culturally relevant stuff or inclusive stuff? So that's what we're gonna talk about. And I'll talk about the different words that I use and why, and the scholars that use them. So CRP and inclusion, hopefully y'all can see this at HSIs. So the first thing I want you to do before we move forward is just to think about what do you actually know about culturally relevance or cultural relevance or inclusive practices on campus. And by that I mean, what does it actually mean, right? Like what does it mean to be culturally relevant on a college campus, or what does it mean to be inclusive on a college campus? So I want you to think about that first. What does it mean? And then if you have any examples, and they don't have to be from your campus, I would like them from your campus, but you might also have examples from your own campus, right? Maybe you were at a different campus, or where you went to school, or whatever, right? But like examples of, like good examples of cultural relevance, right? Because if I think about good examples, I think about my undergraduate institution. I'm like, there's some great stuff that went on there, right? Not just where I'm at my current institution, right? So go ahead and spend a couple minutes thinking about that. You can write, take notes, or you can think about it, meditate on it. What does it mean? I want us to make sure we're all on the same page. What does cultural relevance mean? And what are some good examples of it on college campuses? So who has a definition? What does it mean to be culturally relevant on a college university campus and/or inclusive?
I mean, I'll take a stab at it. Pretty much where it's integrated and into everything that we do. So when we think about developing programs or outreach to the community or how we're going to engage students and faculty, and we think about that as in the front of our brains in terms of how we're going to integrate that into what we do.
When you say we think about that and what are you referring to?
The fact that you have multiple cultures on your campus, that you need to engage not just the Hispanic community, but I think multiculturally across all diverse student populations.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that's big when I visit HSIs, is people are very reluctant to say we only serve Hispanic students, right? That's clear across the board. No HSI wants to only serve one type of student, right? They're like, no, we serve lots of students, right? And even our Latino population is super diverse, right? And so we can't serve them all in the same way either. So, okay, other thoughts on cultural relevance, what that looks like or what it means?
For me, it means making everyone feel comfortable and safe with who they are and being able to express who they are.
Okay.
I think it also involves, at the curricular level, you were talking about not a lot of students don't have the opportunity to read Latino writers and things. I think it goes beyond that. I think it's a kind of an acknowledgement within the curriculum that a lot of the subjects are going to be understood and seen differently by different cultures. History, for example, it's not a shared experience.
Right,
so
right.
It's an acknowledgement at the curricular level as well. That there are differences that need to be discussed.
Yeah, I talk about that as ways of knowing. Like when I write about it, it's like we all have different ways of knowing, right? And are we recognizing all the ways of knowing in our curriculum, in our programs, in our practices? Right here.
So I think this conversation is important to remember institutionally that these conversations are ever evolving, dynamic, right? And so that what we define as an approach to cultural relevance and inclusion today is not necessarily going to be the same tomorrow or a year from now or 2 years from now. I think the sentiments and the fundamentals that we use to approach it may continue in sort of an unchanged manner, but how we actually treat, the work that we do is going to be ever changing. And so as a part of that, I think it's important to ensure that systematically we set up a place where voices are heard and not lost. All voices across the spectrum, right? Student voices, voices of not just faculty or administrators, but staff who may not play prominent roles. our facilities folks, our folks on the ground who are interacting with students in ways that we may never get to interact with them. So I think those opportunities to continuously define our work, or to remember to continuously define our work, and to have conversations with folks who are not listening to and allowing that conversation not to be lost is really important.
I love that you say that, because I went to an HSI in December, and I talked to a student there. I was talking to students, and they talked about, I said, what makes you feel like you belong here? Where do you feel like you have a sense of belonging? And the one student said, my cleaning lady in my residence hall, she talks to me in Spanish, and she cooks for me, and she's like my mom, you know, and she was like in tears. She's like my cleaning lady in the residence hall. And she said, and then my cleaning lady in the residence hall got moved, and that affected her. Right? Like, so are we recognizing that every single person, right? And I talk about that, every single person in the university gets to contribute to the HSI, right? And so for students, if your facility staff and your cleaning staff are the Latinos, they matter. Because students are gonna talk to them, and they're gonna feel more likely to go to them than their philosophy teacher who's an old white dude, right? And I'm just gonna throw that out there, that your old white dude might be a philosophy teacher, right? But like, they feel that sense of connection, right? I wanna talk to somebody that feels like my mom, right? And she just so happens to be the cleaning lady, right? And that's important. So, yeah.
I was going to go on the fact with no matter race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, so on and so forth. It's about having a place at the table, because looking, the higher up you go is kind of, I want to look and find someone that looks like me or has that identity that's like me, because they may understand some sort of struggle. It's not going to be the same struggle because
Right.
we all have different experiences,
Right.
but being able to have that representation at the table is such an importance.
Right.
And it's like you have some sort of a voice, but then at the end of it, you're also knowing that someone is able to understand where you may have come from, and that come from, and how you move.
And we know that the more higher up you go, the less people there are like you. Whatever that like you is, there's less of them, right? There's less of them the further up you go. And that's why I bring up the numbers of faculty, staff, graduate students. Like, what do those numbers look like? Right here, and then we'll go over here.
I always struggle to talk about inclusion without talking about exclusion.
Yes. Oh, good point.
So for me, prior to or along with creating practices that are inclusive and diverse, and when we talk about multiculturalism and bringing people together, we also have to look at the ways in which our practices and policies exclude.
Yes.
Kind of talking about who's at the table, and really working to undo
Yes.
that
Yes.
simultaneously.
Yes.
Because if we leave those practices in place, we can do whatever we want to do to include, and the system would continue to be the
Right.
same.
Right.
Because exclusion is always in practice.
Absolutely. I'm going to talk about some assumptions, and it gets exactly at that. That, like, the assumption is that we're exclusionary. Don't make the assumption that we're inclusionary, particularly just because your population of students is diverse, because your practices are so exclusionary. Absolutely.
Something that's been coming about in like the NACE competency world is that one of the newest competencies, the global.
Can you tell us what NACE competency world is?
Oh yeah, so it's a career center background. You could explain it more better than I can. I'm just learning about it, and there are different competencies to get students ready for a career path. Is that the best way to explain that?
Basically what employers want from their students.
Okay.
And one of the newest competencies to the framework, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the global intercultural fluency, and I think that's really rare, because I don't think that was a competency when I was a student in college, and now trying to train my student leaders in that area is, I'm finding, I don't know, not difficult, but challenging to get them ready for the world with so many different aspects of it,
Right, yeah, absolutely.
because they come from so many different types of backgrounds.
Yeah.
So trying to get them to accept all different cultures, races,
Right.
genders,
Right.
the whole entire thing.
Right, and then it's complex, because exactly what you brought up over here is because, so in higher ed, this is a whole different conversation, and you've heard this talk, Bill. There's a conversation around, we've always been about diversity and inclusion. It's like, hey, we all love each other, hug each other. And those of us that are suggesting that that's not a good model are saying, no, we need to say, nah, what is excluding all of us, right? We need to move to a justice model, right? An equity and justice model, because hugging each other and love each other and being multicultural and understanding different cultures is not what's gonna, you wanna think about sending your students out into the world and them disrupting white supremacy in their workplace. How does that happen, right? You want them to be aware, to be like, dang, all this white supremacy around, I'm the only person of color, and how do I disrupt it? Right, as the only person of color, and there's nobody else that looks like me, as opposed to like, yay, they're all gonna embrace me and hug me, because I'm the difference. Your students are gonna go out into the workforce, and they're the difference. And everyone's gonna be like, yay, we love you, let's have food. No, right? Like, no, right? That's not what we're working, right? So that's what we're trying to argue, is like multiculturalism and diversity isn't, that's not where we wanna go. We wanna go disrupting systems of oppression. You know, and there's lots of systems of oppression, patriarchy and white supremacy and all of them, right? Religious oppression, right? There's all these different forms of oppression. And how do you work towards that in your practices, right? Disrupting those. So, and that if your national body doesn't recognize that, how do you recognize that, even though your national body doesn't, right? Because we're still very much in this yay, diversity and multiculturalism world. So, other thoughts on what this means?
The story of the cleaning lady reminds me of how important it is. Language plays an important role in identity and cultural inclusivity. I specifically think about parents of minority students who might not share the institutional language and how they are separated, alienated twice, at least twice, from it. First, because of the culture of the higher education, they might be away from that, and second, because of the language.
Right.
And how many of our mainstream students are accompanied in the decisions about college and all that by their families? I would say that's a very, very important piece of it, while these students actually have to navigate in a way by themselves. But I went too far. The cleaning lady.
The cleaning lady. Well, no, you made important points that I'll
Yes.
bring back. So go ahead, cleaning lady.
Regarding the cleaning lady, it made me think about, it triggered me an idea from Paulo Freire about teachers as cultural workers. And in a way, you know, the cleaning lady is as important as a teacher, as a cultural worker.
Right.
So then staff, everybody else, you know, you don't have to speak the language to be an ally, but you have to know how to be a cultural worker. And that's the message because I was just thinking about it more.
So I would say, like, as far as those cultural workers, they're here. You absolutely have them, because your service type of positions on a university campus are always people of color, right? And if you're in a place there's predominantly Latinos, they're going to be Latinos. If you're in a place where it's predominantly Black, they're going to be Black, right? Like, that's the reality of it, right? And so how do you, as administrators and folks that are at higher levels, embrace those folks and make sure that they're part of the fabric of the institute, right? That they appreciate their jobs, like their jobs, want to be here, and understand that their role is super important, right? To the long-term retention of your students. They matter, right? As far as parents and language and all that, HSIs, there are definitely some that are progressive, and that if we're thinking about good practices, a lot of, you know, those that have already gone this progressive route are thinking about how do you engage families, right? You've got to engage families, and you've got to engage them in their culture and in their language, right? And whether that be orientation or whatever, I mean, it's usually orientations. I've seen family orientations, right? Where you bring in the whole family and you engage them at the early part of the process to make sure they're part of the student's experience, right? Because the family is absolutely part of the experience. Whether or not you include them in that is up to you as a university. How do we include the multiple languages, right? And so, yeah, there's some models. I'll give you some models on institutions I know that are doing that. Did you have a comment?
Yes.
Back to this, what's cultural relevance?
Yes.
Okay, we're still defining.
Access is important.
Meaning what?
Accessibility to information, accessibility to resources. So if we think of images on a campus, what resources are available for either student, for faculty, for staff, and also acknowledgement. I think acknowledgement is an important piece of who you are. First time, 2005, when I first arrived to FAU, I was working in one of the campuses, and somebody told me, today's diversity day. You are diversity. We are giving different cookies. Go get your cookie. You are diversity.
Cookie?
A cookie.
That you eat?
A cookie. So I thought, oh,
Okay.
I'm a diverse cookie. So I went, and I didn't make any comment, but they thought I was a student. So I went and I found like 3 types of cookies. So I asked the organizer, why do we have 3 types of cookies? Because it's diversity day.
It's not people that we want.
Diverse cookies.
Right, so then We learn many things after that.
Now, so I call that diversity, like the food, fun, and festivities, right? Where we just like, we're gonna celebrate diversity with these 3 cookies, right?
Correct, so acknowledgement of who the student is.
Right.
It goes beyond to what you look like in appearance, but what is your value, how much.
Right. Right. We're gonna keep going back to this diversity comment, right? The tensions, because all colleges and universities want diversity and inclusion. But like I said, I'm gonna go into these assumptions about why that's not enough. Because your student enrollment is inclusive. That's it, right? It stops there typically at HSI. That's the reality, is it stops at the student enrollment. That's it. There's nowhere else where you're being inclusive for the most part.
And just a couple of comments. I know your critique of diversity and multiculturalism, right? But as the president of the Florida chapter of multicultural education, let me just say that what we look at in the work that we do is critiquing those things that you are critiquing,
Yeah.
but moving towards social justice, equity, defining the structures. And so for me, I think, yes, it's important to have someone who looks like me, but if you look at this group, I am happy in this group if we are all with the same mindset.
Right.
At least you understand me. I don't have to explain myself. Right? On an institutional level, I want to just throw out some ideas from some of my previous work where I say, what does an institution that does this look like?
Yeah, we'll get into that.
Right, and so all of its institutional practice, I would say, would be, it's ongoing, it's never done. It is integrated, it's normal, it's not just cookie day or the Latino serving courses or whatever. It is multifaceted, everything from staffing to program to clubs to everything, right? It is comprehensive, top to toe, from the president down to the staff. And for me, it is counter-hegemonic.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
It is that disruption
Which is what we're talking about.
of that supremacy.
Did you write this model? It sounds like a model.
It is. But I
I
wrote
feel
it.
like I've read
when I
this
was-
model before.
I wrote it when I was studying what does it mean to engage in internationalization.
Oh,
because
okay,
that
yes.
was the big thing
Yeah.
20 years ago when I was doing my dissertation.
Okay, yeah. But that's the thing, there are models, right? There are models that get at this. I write at the organizational level, so I write about that as well, right? As far as like, it is multifaceted and it's coming from all different directions. And you can't just diversify one part or disrupt one part, right? The exclusionary practices in one part. It has to be everything, right? I propose this model and I include in there alumni and institutional advancement, right? Because we forget about them, and institutional advancement at a university like this is probably its own building. Right, institutional advancement is a massive department at college and university campuses, and we don't engage them in these conversations. Institutional advancement is also highly white as a field, right? It's mostly white people doing institutional advancement work, engaging white people in institutional advancement work, right? Including white alumni, despite the fact that the university is now super compositionally diverse, right? So I talk about that, like you've got to bring in every aspect. You've got to get your IA folks on board, right? You've got to get your community on board. You've got to get everybody on board with disrupting, heteronormative practices, or whatever we're going to call it, hegemonic practices, or white practices, or whatever we want to call them, right? Disrupting those dominant practices. Other things before we get into a little bit more, just talking about what it means, right? It's complicated.
I just wanted to add to, I think that a lot of the characteristics around the groups that we're talking about, and especially you had brought them up earlier in your presentation in the beginning, talking about first-generation students, socioeconomic background. I think those things also play into what we need to think about when we're developing our, the fabric of the culture of our institution.
Absolutely.
And I think that we here have those things, and a lot of times we don't acknowledge those things.
Right, absolutely. I think thinking about the profile that I brought up in the intro speech about what are your profile of your students, getting back to this idea that HSIs, for the most part, nobody wants to just serve Latinx students, right? Like, if I asked all of you, you'd probably say, well, that means we serve a lot of Latinx students, but it does. So you have to think about that, right? It's like, how do you serve low-income students? How do you serve undocumented students? How do you serve immigrant students? How do you serve, people who English wasn't their first language, right? Like all these different things. How do you serve all of them? That's what it means to be an HSI, right? Because there's so many complexities, so many layers of the compositional diversity, right? So knowing that the student body is super complex, right? It complicates it, right? idea. This term, I use CRP, but then I went to inclusion. So the term cultural relevance actually comes out of urban ed literature, right? And that's where I was pulling a lot of the ideas when I was first writing about cultural relevance at an HSI. But it just doesn't capture it at an HSI level, right? Cultural relevance, it sort of, I don't know, it doesn't include everything. Particularly when I think about my student affairs background, and we're very much in this sort of social justice push, and we think about systems of oppression, multiple identities, right? We're thinking about gender, and we're thinking about race, and we're thinking about, nationality, all these different things that are going on, not just culture, right? Culture is sort of like, what the heck is culture anyways, right? So I think about it in a systems level, right? So the presentation doesn't always reflect that, but you can constantly be thinking about that as far as your students. How is it working for your students who are from all these different non-dominant backgrounds, right? And we can keep teasing that out. Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of something. It's important when we talk about being a diverse institution, that the institution is changing as much as that we're not bringing people in and expecting them to come out looking and acting just like the dominant culture at the end.
Yeah.
And that's what institutions typically do. We expect people to come in, they have to do all the adapting.
Yeah. Yeah, we're all on the same page, and we do. Before I move on, because I'm gonna get into some of these things, how many of y'all are faculty? Okay, just so I know who's in. Okay, and how many of y'all are on like student services side? Okay, and then what other areas? Both? Okay, some are both. Okay. Okay, student affairs, a lot of student affairs, stuff. Okay, just so I know, all right, because I do have a lot of stuff on like classroom stuff, but the student affairs folks, we gotta talk about what y'all can do, because you matter, right? Like it matters what you're doing, right? So I guess we don't have a lot of models, huh? Nobody threw out any models of like good inclusive practices. I mean, there's some out there, but the reality is all universities are struggling with this. All universities. I don't know any university that does this well all across the board, right? We're all struggling with what does it mean to be disruptive of dominant ways of knowing, right? And that's what we're gonna talk a little bit about some of that. So when I talk about culturally relevant practices, I'm thinking about the curricula, the pedagogy, and the programs and services, right? Those are the different ways in which I've been thinking about it, particularly at HSI. Right, and I talk about like this model of including other aspects of an organization. I'm not going to talk about all those aspects, right? Like the institutional advancement portion. It's important, but we're going to focus on these sort of practices here. And I put down here technology, the means of converting materials into output, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the outcomes y'all want, right? What do you want your students to get, right? So I think about HSIs, and people ask like, what would be my ideal outcome of an HSI? It's not, graduating students is like, yes, we're always going to want to graduate students. We're always going to want students to get jobs. Like, yes, we want those things. Every institution wants those. I want students to graduate and be socially conscious, right? Like, if I think about the ideal HSI, it does that, right? And that's at every level, not just in the classroom, it's out of the classroom too, right? That's an important outcome, I think, right? Socially conscious people, and all people, right? So your white folks that are in HSIs, that they go out and they disrupt white supremacy, because they learned about it in their HSI, right? They were in a diverse place, and they learned that it's not just about multiculturalism, it's about being conscious of the fact that when you go out there, the folks of color are minoritized, right? And they're gonna be in these workplaces where they're gonna be minoritized. How do you disrupt that, right? So we need to teach students that in the classroom and out of the classroom, right? Socially conscious, right? So, or critical consciousness, right? You talk about Freire, right? That's critical consciousness. So that's an important outcome for me. Right, and so we'll get into outcomes, and I'll ask y'all what other outcomes you think are important. But first, let's talk a little bit about this HSI identity. Right, I already talked about how the only thing that unites HSIs is that they have 25% enrollment, right, of Latinx students. That's it, nothing else, and they're not for profit, right? That's important. They're not for profit, and they enroll 25% or more. Other than that, they're just so diverse, right? There's so many different things going on in HSIs. But the important thing is, does this work? Let's see. They lack the historical mission to serve students. And this is going to get into some of the assumptions I'm going to talk about. We have to be like, yes, we lack the historical mission to serve Latinx students. We also lack the mission to serve anybody else besides white, male people with money, right? And why is that? Because institutions of higher ed were founded for those people, right? So if you're not white, male, and with money, and all those three things together, talk about intersectionality, all of those three things together, if you're not those things, you weren't intended to be here. All right, and if I just look around the room, I can make assumptions, but it doesn't look like there's very many of those, right? And so none of you are intended to be here. whether as a student or a faculty member or a staff, none of you were intended to be, historically back when we think about institutions of higher ed. So we have to disrupt. We got to disrupt what institutions of higher ed were intended to do, right? So we lack the historical mission to serve Latinx students or minoritized students, right? We just don't have that mission, and so we don't know. And so that's where everybody's asking, like I said, that $1 million question. How do we serve Latinx students or minoritized students? And so we have to actively do that, right? Which is why when institutions invite me to come do these talks, I'm like, yes, I will be there because I want you to do this work. I want folks to be thinking about this. I want you to be engaging in this work daily, right? Every day and thinking about it because we have to. And it's hard work.
So kind of going off what we were talking about this morning, is there going to be a shift towards relabeling Hispanic serving institutions to Latinx serving institutions?
My opinion? Or for reals, for reals? I'll give you my opinion. My opinion is no, because HSI is a federal designation. So the federal government also came up with the term Hispanic, right? So if we think about the federal government labeling, like labels, we were labeled Hispanic, we're also labeled Hispanic serving institution. So it's a federal term. I think it's not an important argument. That's my opinion. Right, there's so many more complexities of an HSI beyond what it's called, and I'm like, okay, their HSI is fine, right? Get over it. I don't like the term Hispanic, but that's what it is, right? So I don't know that the fight is worth it, right? As opposed to fighting for funding and fighting for changing the institution, because it's the federal government decides what they want to call it.
Let me give you a perspective on a battle that in my field of TESOL, we won. The federal designation for English language learners was deficit-based oriented, LEP, limited English proficiency. We in the literature, as we write, as we go to conferences, reframe that little by little over the years. And that was a federal, like no child behind left, as I like to call it.
All children left behind.
Had that infamous, right there. And prior to that, in the literature, we began to silently but slowly push against that. First, we began with ELL, English language learners, which was but it only recognizes the English in them. Then Ofelia Garcia, in 2008, came up with the term emergent bilinguals. And now we're pushing it into, at least in my work, I'm pushing it into emerging to advanced bilingual, so that you recognize a continuum and you can recognize the bilinguality on it. So as a result, the federal government is now kind of moved from limited to English language learners. I don't know if that serves any purpose, but I think there's
Language
a lot.
matters.
It matters.
It matters,
absolutely
right?
matters. And maybe it matters for us to actually be officially a Hispanic serving institution, federally, but then within our label, within our institution, to actually reframe it as Latinx serving institution. And we can do that.
You can do that within yours, yeah.
Within our, I don't know what people think about that, but it would be great to have some insight into that if we have collected some emails and then send a survey monkey or something, so that it's not something coming from our research group, but from us. We make it what we want. If we want it,
Which is what I was saying, right? Like you guys define that. I think it's important to note that also limited English proficiency is deficit, right? That's a very deficit term. I don't know that Hispanic necessarily is deficit. I mean, we could argue that all day. It's the federal government's term, right? For a group of people, it wasn't a term that the Nixon administration said, here's the term.
I was joking about Hispanic. Why Hispanic and not? It's always Hispanic and not her panic or their panic. No, just kidding.
So it is deficit. It's gendered. It's gendered, just like everything else.
But it goes back to the colonial history.
Yeah, exactly. There is colonial history there, right? So there is.
So there is something going on there.
There is. But I think there's this big theme going on today about language, right? And so, yeah, I'm all for y'all. If y'all decide you want to be Latinx serving, go for it, right? But that's part of you defining who you are, right? It's like me. I decide if I'm like, I identify as Chicana because I identify as Chicana. I'm not saying anybody else should. I'm just saying I do, right? If y'all decide we identify as Latinx, then we are, right? And that's okay. And then, yeah, federally, the technical term, you're still an HSI, right? Technically, if you want to apply for HSI funds, you're an HSI, right? But what you project to the world and what you do can be Latinx everything, right? That's where I'm at with this identity, right? That like, y'all, do it. Do what you want to do. Do you and figure out this for FAU, right? Because that's what's important, that you figure it out here. So that's my thoughts. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts, but that's yeah, HSI, you know, it's complicated. So here's the reality, ethnocentricity. I'm going to use the term that's used in this article up here. This article called Minority Politics and Group Differentiated Curricula at Minority Serving Colleges in the Review of Higher Education. So this article is super important. It lays out ethnocentricity, and the author defines ethnocentricity as experiences, perspectives, and culture of particular groups are centered as a point of reference. Right, and specifically disrupts the idea of multiculturalism, right? Same thing, like, no, this isn't about all cultures, it's not about, it's about centering one experience, right? So whatever that ethnicity is, it's centering one experience. So it might be Latinx, I think the author does Latinx, Black, and also Native, because there's 3 different minority types, minority serving institutions in the article: tribal colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, and historically Black colleges and universities. Right, so looking at whether or not those 3 groups are centering those groups' experiences with some pretty important data. And basically what the article shows is that for HSIs, the article shows for HBCUs and tribal colleges as well. So if you're interested in this topic, you can take a look at the article. But for HSIs specifically, intentional HSIs, there's not very many. Those are HSIs that were actually founded as HSIs. There's very few. But there are a few, and a lot of them actually have gone bankrupt. The ones that I have known of. But of those, only 14% of their curriculum was ethnocentric. And this was like with an extensive review of their curriculum. For the Puerto Rican institutions, so y'all know that all the institutions in Puerto Rico are HSIs, right? And for those institutions, only 8% had ethnocentric curriculum, right? So in a country that the dominant language is Spanish, right? The culture is still, what they're learning in the classroom is still white dominant, right? This is colonialism, right? That's white colonialism, right? We're colonized people, right? So yes, that's what's that's what's happening even in places where, you know, we would think like Puerto Rico, there should be more ethnocentric or cultural. It's not, right? The curriculum is still white and dominant and normative, right? Incidental HSIs, which is yours, right? That you just become one. Only 2% of the whole curriculum was ethnocentric. Right, so this article, I use this all constantly citing this, right? I'm always citing this article because I'm like, this is why you've got to disrupt your curriculum, right? And this is just curricular practices. Nobody's done this for like your student services side of the house. Somebody needs to do that. We need to do that. I bet you it's smaller, right? Because I go to HSIs all the time and there's just nothing that's centered, on any specific ethnicity and or Latinos, right? So that's really important to think about, right? And I argue that we can't expect our ethnic studies programs to do this work. Okay, because that's usually what happens. Is we're like, yeah, we're doing this. Like, look at the Latinx studies department. They're doing it over there. Really, with your 1 full-time faculty member and your 3 adjuncts, they're doing all the work for the entire university. And I say that because that's what ethnic studies programs look like. For the most part, right? Tiny little departments, if they're a department. They might be a program, they might be a certificate out of another area. Right, because that's how ethnic studies programs emerge. They emerge as programs up, before you eventually get lines. All right, but very few universities have like lots and lots of lines in ethnic studies. Right, in California, they're pretty progressive. There's some in California, but that's not happening in most of the country. So that's why the curriculum looks like this. So your STEM curriculum, your health sciences, your business, all of that, computer sciences, all of it is essentially white. Right, that's what students are learning. So when they step into the classroom where they spend most of their time, they're never going to get to experience any of their own ways of knowing, right? And those ways of knowing are important. And we strip them, right? You said this earlier. Are you the person that said about stripping students? Yeah, so that they look the same. We strip them of that in the classroom. We take all of that because we're not putting their ways of knowing in the classroom, right? So this is important. Those of you that are faculty, look at your department. Look at your whole think about your whole department, your whole school, and think like, who's offering this, right? And it might be one person, or it might be you, right? I talked to a person who says she's an adjunct. She's like, I do this in my class. I was like, yeah, you're the one, probably, right? She's like, and I'm an adjunct, so nobody cares. That's important too, right? That's true. That's how adjuncts feel. Nobody cares. I'm just here, just part-time, why would they care about what I'm doing? So, any thoughts on this? Is this surprising? Uh-huh.
I just want to say, every critique that you've made is forefront in the critiques of multicultural educators.
Mhm.
So I just want to make sure the field is represented here.
Yeah.
That it is, we are on the same page. So
Yeah.
when we think about diversity and multiculturalism, usually our critiques of what's going on there is for folks who are not
Right.
doing it.
Right.
They think they're doing it. But
Can I ask you a question? When you're thinking about it, is it at the K through 12 level or post-secondary level?
At this point of time, we are looking at both K-12, what's going on in school, but
Yeah.
also teacher preparation and leadership preparation.
Okay. Because, I mean, like I said, I pull from urban ed literature, and it's primarily K through 12. So I pull from urban ed literature because there's a lot of smart things going on there, and the multicultural education people, but in the reality, at the post-secondary level, we are not doing this work at all, right?
So
There's
I'm
no-
representing a field. I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah, and higher education, so because I'm a higher ed scholar and that's my area of research, that's where, if I pull from that, there's people who aren't doing this work, right? Looking at what this looks like to have ethnocentric curriculum across the curriculum, right? Mm-hmm.
But I also think, like, you brought it up earlier with the IR people
Mm-hmm.
in the room, like, who was in the room today for the plenary? Like, who was, like, in the room? People that were in the room were the people that already have an idea that we need to change the type of system and
Right.
structure and
Right.
disrupt.
Right.
And the people that need to be in the room
Right,
weren't there
right.
as to why we still are part of this perpetuated cycle.
Right.
What can, I guess that's where I'm answering with, like, what am I doing? Because I'm in that adjunct position where in my class, I'll teach things in this way and I'll throw out that from the curriculum, and if I get in trouble, well, I'm still a graduate student and we'll see what happens, but I want to do it because my job is done.
Right.
And so at the end of the day, they're like, I appreciate the fact that you went out of the comfort zone and put us through these situations, but I'm the adjunct, so I'm at the bottom of this totem pole, and they're getting this like experience that was changed, but the people that need to hear it are those people
Right.
in power, and how do we effectively,
Right.
I guess, skew that, change that?
Right.
That's where it's going to really change the atmosphere here.
Right. Well, and the reality is, when I give talks at HSIs, it's always with the choir. Right? Y'all know that term, like you're always preaching to the choir. You all already know this stuff. And so the choir comes and you all practice, and then everybody else continues to do their things, and they aggress students in the classroom, and their curriculum is not ethnocentric, and the programs continue to do what they are, right? Like, y'all are the choir, right? The choir comes to the diversity day, right? What is this called, diversity symposium? Choir comes to the diversity symposium. All the rest of the people, and I'm gonna pick on STEM. I always say the STEM people, where are the STEM people? Are there any STEM people in the room?
I can represent, yeah, so I'm.
You're STEM, yay! One of all these people. What's going on in STEM? STEM, y'all thinking about
So
this?
I came here on my own initiative, but I'm the director of FAU's NSF Advance.
Okay, yes,
grant. So we have a seat grant through the provost office.
Yes.
And the goal is to increase women and underrepresented minorities in the STEM colleges and STEM careers here at FAU. And again, I'm finding that the diversity initiatives at FAU are siloed, right?
Right,
So,
yeah.
I'm just
Absolutely.
reaching out and saying, okay, I was appointed this position, I've been in the provost office with the provost team. They're not
Yeah.
here, but I'm
Right.
here. I'm gonna go back, and I think for those of us who are in the choir, I'm faculty, so I'm the one faculty
Yes.
representative, they make me the director, so I'm trying to navigate all
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So, how do we be disruptive, yet include them? Because
Yeah.
once you get disruptive, they're like, oh, are you an activist?
Right.
Oh my goodness, are you an activist? You know,
Right, right.
what do we do with you now?
Right.
And so I don't have those skills.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
need to learn how to be an upstander, or
Yeah.
how to be in these meetings and not just walk out going like, oh, I don't belong.
Yeah.
I don't belong in
Yeah.
this group. I belong here in the choir.
Right, yeah, no, absolutely. STEM, I pick on STEM because STEM, we tend to not see a lot of STEM
Because they're
folks
so
do
busy
this
in
work.
their labs, you know, I should be in my lab, I should be, you
Yeah.
know,
But
it's
you're-
so hard to divide and conquer.
Right, yeah, no, absolutely. I think also too, there's this idea with like STEM, generally that knowledge is, it's all the same. It comes from the same, one way of knowing, right? And that STEM, math is, there's only one way to teach math, right? In reality, it's like, no, that's not the case, right? Like, all curricula can be transformed and can center minoritized ways of knowing, right? But you've got to be creative, right? So those of us that teach, whether you're adjunct, a grad student, whatever, those of us that teach, that have tried to do this, and put diverse ways of knowing in our curriculum and in our syllabus in our classroom, no, it's really, really hard.
Yes.
It's so hard to do. It's so, and students push back,
Yeah.
okay? Women of color get the worst teaching evaluations. This has been documented. Why? Because people are like, they come in, they're angry, there's this, they put race. Believe me, I get all this. She put race and there's no race. This isn't a race in education. Why is she teaching race in higher ed? And I'm like, because it's my reality. This is my way of knowing. Right? But it's hard to even do that because nobody's written about some of these things, right? I'm like, how do I get Native history in my history of higher ed class? Nobody's really written about it. There's like 2 articles, right? And so the knowledge isn't out there. The knowledge hasn't been produced. And then, so it's hard to put it into the curriculum anyways, right? Even when you're really actively thinking about it. And then you do, and students push back, right? You get the worst evaluations. And I'm like, oh, I'm never going to get tenure because I'm the worst teacher, right? Because they didn't want race in the curriculum. And I put race in the curriculum. And they feel like they were bamboozled, right? That I came out, whoop, and I'm going to throw race in there even though they weren't expecting it, right? But same thing. I'm like, Bob, if I don't do it, who's going to do it? Right? If I'm the only one that can do it, and guess what? Then I don't I also then don't get asked to teach that class again. That's happened also. Don't teach that class, don't let Gina teach that class because she comes in and she makes everybody mad. I'm like, I woke them up. I didn't make them mad. They're now woke. We got a bunch of woke people walking around. You're mad because 60 ED students are woke now and they're calling you out in your class. Don't be mad at me. I was just waking them up. So, sorry, did I make, did you have a comment?
I had a comment / question regarding pushback. I wanted to go back to the career development aspect. If you're talking about disruption, right, which already is a word that can put people on the defensive, right? But I'm all about it. That's why I'm here. So thank you for using the word. But the question is, how do we teach students what disruption looks like and how it feels like, and how to deal with the consequences, the very real consequences of disrupting, whether it is within higher education or in the workforce. There are some very real consequences. What does it look like and feel like?
Right.
And we see all the time when people disrupt systems of oppression.
Right.
They require that all of these things that you're talking about. Do you have any comments or thoughts about moving to that level of like preparing students, like you're going to disrupt, but this is what you're going to come up with. They're not going to, they're not going to sing kumbaya with you.
Right. No.
Disrupt.
Right.
They might want to kill you.
Right, yeah,
And that's
absolutely.
real.
Right, it's real. We get attacked for disrupting. I think it's important when I think about disruption that it's not activism necessarily, right? So, because I think there's negative connotations of it. That like we don't necessarily have to have students storm the administration building and sit in, right? If we think about a 1960s model, right? That was disruption in the 1960s, and that was an important movement. The civil rights movement on college campuses transformed institutions, right? We have ethnic studies programs and multicultural centers because of that movement, because of the 1960s and 1970s. That, historically, in institutions of higher ed, is essential. That doesn't have to look like that in 2018. Students don't have to storm buildings and sit until and handcuff themselves to the walls until the police come in and take them out. Like, that doesn't have to be disruption, right? So stressing to students that disruption isn't necessarily full-on activism. Right? You don't have to go protest, you don't have to have a sign, you don't have to march, right? Some students want to do that. You have students that want to do that, and I encourage them, and I encourage you to support them to do that. But understanding that being silent and doing it in their writing, maybe, those of you that are faculty, that you can disrupt through your writing, right? Just raising their consciousness and allowing them to write about those things and giving them the opportunity is important. Right? And so you got to think about that. It's not just this full-on out, I'm an activist, right? And I'm going to storm the building, right? It can be a whole different, all kinds of different things, right? And I think you can do that on the curricular side, but also on the student services side, right? Like in your programming, it's like, how do we encourage students to think critically about what's going on, right? How do we think, and maybe it's not always necessarily related to identities. Maybe it's related to like, how do we get our students in residence halls to advocate for low wages of the cleaning staff, right? Let's connect it back. The cleaning staff, their wages aren't fair and equitable, and that cleaning staff we've now established as a group is important because they help students feel like they belong, but their wages are low. How do we get students on board with like, let's advocate for those staff, right? And do it in a way that's productive and teach them how to be civically engaged without storming buildings, right, without getting arrested and any of those sort of things, but having that sort of ability to think consciously and critically about these people who they care about, their wages, right? Right, so it's like just getting to thinking, right, how do we connect all these sort of dots, right, without being full on, let's march, right, because a lot of people don't want to march. Many of people, most of your students are not going to want to march, right, but it doesn't mean they're not activists.
I find it really interesting. I think this discussion is been really helpful for me. My experience has been with this kind of middle culture where, you know, you have a mixed family of both, and language is important, and all of these things play in. And I think that when I was growing up, it was called third culture, like third culture kids. I had the benefit of language, but when I got into higher education and initially started teaching, I found that I was teaching this generation of students who were third culture kids, much like myself, but they did not have language. And so I found that as I was working with them, I was discovering that they themselves had come to the university to sort of find their Hispanic identity, to find their Latino identity, find their Chicano identity, and getting active in these ways that you're talking about right now slowly help them get there. And so I think it's important also to address that this in-between generation exists, and it's part of, you know, providing experiences for them to discover who they are is important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're talking about was kind of like when I talk about like my ideal outcome of an HSI is critical consciousness. I want everybody to be critical. I want everybody marching or whatever marching looks like, right? I want them to be aware of systems of oppression, aware how our society has structured itself by race, right? And by other things, right? Like economic status, right? Like we're structured in many, many different ways that some are privileged and some aren't, right? I want everybody to recognize that, right? And that's important, and that happens at the university. But in reality, we can't make assumptions that our minoritized students are even aware of their own oppression, right? The reality is probably most of them are not, right? And so if you're not teaching that to them, they're not gonna know, and they're gonna leave, continue to think that no, the world is great, right? The world is fine, we're all Americans, right? That was the conversation, that term, right? Me and Dr. Salinas looked at each other and like rolled our eyes, right? We're like, well, yeah, but no, right? Because, right, like that term is probably, like to say we're all one is problematic, right? Because the reality is I look at all of you and I make assumptions based on what I see immediately, right? And if anybody tells me that's not true, that's not true, right? Like we are not a color neutral society, right? We are not. Everybody gets judged. Right? Black men are killed by police at higher levels than any other group because of them being judged based on what they look like. They are an immediate threat, right? Just because of what they look like, right? That could be a doctor, a physician, a well-renowned physician, right? Like, and that person gets killed because of what they look like, right? So we know that. That's the reality, right? So I want all students to leave with that reality. The reality is a lot of your students out there don't think that's the case. They think that all lives matter. They think that it's all multicultural, hug, kumbaya, whatever, right? Like, that's what they think. Right? So if you're not teaching them, who's going to teach them? Right? And it needs to happen at every aspect of the university, right? And what these data, in just a small study, right? We like studies, it's always like, it's not generalizable. It isn't, but it is, right? Like this is true, right? The reality is universities are not centering minoritized ways of knowing. They're not. We know that. Historically, they have not been, right? So this is your opportunity to center minoritized ways of knowing, and all minoritized ways of knowing, not just people of color. Right? There's lots of different minoritized students on your campus.
And did you say previously that a few of the universities that were mainly ethnocentric, they went bankrupt? Is that what you said?
No, I said intentional HSIs. So I know of like 8 or so. There were like 8 HSIs that were founded as Hispanic certain institutions. Most of them have gone bankrupt. So there's, let's see if I can name them. So I know one really well in Chicago. There were like 2 or 3 in California. There's actually I want to say there's a bilingual institution here in Florida. I'm not sure where, but there's a bilingual English-Spanish. So there were like 8 or so of them. I'm not going to try to name them because I'm going to mess them all up. But they were intentionally founded to serve Latinx people, and several of them have gone bankrupt. So there's a very few intentional HSIs. Most of them are incidental or accidental or whatever we're going to call them, right? They become HSIs.
Sorry, I have a mini follow-up. Are there any that are, like, that pass half, at least of 50%, like any HSIs, institutions that pass that, the ethnocentric, that you know, where their curriculum?
That's a general, but no. Even the intentional HSIs aren't doing it. They're still centering dominant ways of knowing. That's the point of this article, right? That we center dominant ways of knowing no matter what. Even if you're a bilingual English-Spanish institution, you're still centering, right? So the one I know work with is St. Augustine College in Chicago. They're bilingual institution, English-Spanish, to serve the Latinx population. And I observed classrooms at that university, and they centered dominant ways of knowing. I observed a ESL class, for lack of a better term. I know y'all gonna give me pushback, but that's what they call it, an ESL class. And I was like, whoa, this is horrible, right? My grad student was like, oh my God, right? Like, well, I can't believe this is happening. I'm like, because we think if you have to learn English, you gotta learn it in this dominant way, right? And I'm gonna stand on the board and teach you these like, very specific like things. It was horrible. And this institution was founded as a Latino-serving institution. English-Spanish bilingual institution. But they're doing transitional bilingual services so that adults who are Spanish-speaking can just get by on the basics of English. So they can pass.
That's actually the goal
Just
of
gotta
higher
transition.
education, to produce people who can pass.
Who can pass, yeah. As opposed to, so they weren't embracing a bilingual model. They're not embracing a bilingual model that was like, because I asked them, I was like, so what if I come in and I am English speaking? Do I get to learn Spanish? Is it bilingual like that? And they're like, no. They're like, we're just teaching the Spanish people to speak English, right? So that they can survive in the US. I'm like, but that's not really bilingual. Bilingual is everybody's learning 2 languages, right? I was like, I'm not an expert in bilingual education, but that's what I think. We all are learning multiple languages together. And we're writing and learning and speaking in multiple languages in the classroom, right? That wasn't happening, and this was an intentional HSI. So yeah, it's not happening. We believe in dominant ways of knowing in the US, no matter what.
We need to run this.
Oh,
Is there criteria that defines what ethnocentric is in the classroom?
well, I mean, that was pretty much the definition in this article. The experiences, perspectives, and culture of particular groups are centered. So that's what this particular author defined as ethnocentric.
And are there examples of what's been successful in terms of, say that 2% or?
Most of those are ethnic studies courses. That's why I like to point out that you can't expect your ethnic studies programs to do it. But ethnic studies programs, by their nature, center one ethnicity, right?
So are there any?
Latinxes or Chicanxes or whatever it may be, African Americans, it's one group, and you're centering that group.
Right. So are there other means or other, is there anything written or studies done that show other means to, infuse that into the curriculum in other ways?
I have some slides. Y'all, we are never gonna get through all these slides. I got like 50 minutes. I got a couple slides that I do that too. Let me see what else I have here. Goodness, I didn't know, y'all are a good group. Y'all just talking, I love it. So back to this idea of what it means to be an HSI, like I talk about these identities. And so as I developed this particular workshop, I was thinking about Latinx enhancing, right? Because I've visited institutions that are Latinx enhancing. So let me tell you what that is. These are institutions that enroll at least the 25% minimum, and they don't necessarily produce equitable outcomes, right? And these are equitable outcomes based on what I call legitimized ways of knowing. This is based on the dominant way of knowing that we think institutions should graduate students, right? Like that's what we think should happen. And they're not necessarily doing that in equitable numbers, but they do have organizational structures that are culturally relevant and enhancing. Right, so that's what a Latinx enhancing institution is. By my definition, I came up with a typology, and so I've written about this particular institution, a Latinx enhancing institution. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of those. But getting into some of the assumptions, I like to talk about the assumptions, right? So first, before you can move into being culturally relevant or inclusive, you have to recognize that Latinxes have been historically excluded from education at all levels, right? Not just post-secondary ed, but K through 12 as well, right? So by the time they get to post-secondary ed, they've already been through what I would call the jungle, already beat up, and barely survived and made it, and they're one who made it to post-secondary ed, because a lot of them don't. A lot of your Latinx students will never actually step foot on your campus. So the fact that they made it already, is what a huge accomplishment, right? Because the numbers and the stats would show you that a majority will not, right? And it's gendered. Men are less likely to ever make it onto this campus than women, right? We know that, right? So this gendered as well. And so we need to recognize that. You need to be like upfront with that and say like our student population has been minoritized throughout their educational environment. How do we move forward knowing that? how do we then say, okay, well, we're still gonna serve them, right? So when I say inclusive practices, there's an assumption that institutions of higher ed continue to uphold structural racism through curriculum, pedagogy, and practices, right? So I spend a lot of time helping universities understand what does racism look, right? So because if I ask everybody on a university campus, they'll all say they're not racist. Nobody's racist. Nobody's racist. Nobody admits they're racist. And that's cool. It doesn't mean you're not upholding. Even if you're not individually racist, doesn't mean you're not upholding racist structures. And people of color uphold racist structures all the time. All the time, right? So we do it as well, right? And until we're able to notice how are we upholding white supremacy, we can't disrupt the white supremacy, right? And so we have to understand that the curriculum privileges white students, it centers white experiences and voices, it upholds racial privilege, it silences students of color. When you walk into a room, a classroom, or into a program, those of you that are in student services, and you're not there and your voice isn't heard, you are silenced. Your voice doesn't get heard, right? That's silencing. It marginalizes, trivializes, and or appropriates, right? That's another thing. Universities are good at appropriating experiences, right? Like, yeah, we're gonna be all like, yeah, we're gonna embrace other groups and stuff, and then appropriates it, right? Y'all are shaking your head. What does that mean? Anybody want to give me what does it mean to appropriate? Or give me an example.
Well, like example with the cookies.
The cookies. Yes, exactly, right? Like so surface level, right? You gotta football team names, right? Appropriating and like celebrating heritage, but celebrating an inappropriate race, right? But that those people, and appropriation is typically done by the people who are not in the group, right? The group doesn't get to, right? And I'll give talks and I'll be like, don't stop celebrating groups, right? Like stop doing that. And they're like, but my Latinx student group, they really like doing that. I said, okay, I take it back. They can do it, right? Let them do it, support them, but I'm talking about everybody else, like, yay, we're gonna have a Taco Tuesday, right? Like, no, you're not. Let your Latino students decide what they're gonna do, and it's probably not that, right? And if you're doing a good job at creating critically conscious students, they're definitely not gonna do that. They're gonna teach you about themselves, about you, about yourself, and how you're not supporting them, and how they've been excluded all this time, right?
Or even as simple as like, and I've seen it, and I saw this in a colleague's post, like, the essence of appropriating someone's culture by wearing sombreros and mustaches. I may not identify as Mexicano, but I feel offended because I'm just like, you're just appropriating someone's culture and exposing it, exploiting it. So it's just not correct.
Because most of us don't walk around in sombreros or have mustaches. Right? Right? So, like, I mean, but that's appropriation at its core, right? I've written about that too. Racially themed parties. Why is that a thing? I don't know, but they continue to happen all the time. Racially themed parties. People dressed like a race, right? That is racist. If you don't think it's racist, you go read the article. Okay, lay it out why it is racist. Mm-hmm.
The thing that drives me nuts, faculty, they will interview the Latino students about their experiences, write about them, but not perhaps do anything about that information that has come. So for me, that's exploitation and appropriation.
Right.
You use their voices to get your promotion and tenure. What did you turn around and do for them?
Right.
That goes back to the point of upholding those racist structures and the paradigm that we
And that's largely done through promotion and tenure. Besides, you get tenure, right? That's largely done through promotion and tenure. I'd talk about that too. Like until we disrupt how people are promoted, and not just faculty, everybody, how people are rewarded and promoted on a college campus, we will continue to uphold white supremacy. Because we're rewarded. I always say, the whiter I am, the more likely I am to get tenure. Meaning that I do the things that the institution has historically told me I'm supposed to do, which is what white males with economic privilege decided was a tenure structure, right? So I'm not encouraged to go out and work with my community. That's not encouraged. I'm not gonna get tenure for that. I'm not gonna get promoted for that, right? I'm encouraged to do things that are recognized by the white systemic structure, right? So.
Well, and I think that speaks to the idea of sort of fetishizing struggle, right? It's sexy at an academic level to talk about the issues and challenges of marginalized populations and minoritized students, right? Without having any corresponding obligation to help those students. You can put that in a place where it's not even relevant anymore, but you are, again, rewarded for having identified it as this really sexy, interesting topic that everybody should know about. In addition to that, I think I want to talk a little bit about sort of this idea of upholding structural racism practices. So I have a unique perspective here because while I'm a doctoral student here in the Educational Leadership Program, I'm also a campus administrator at Palm Beach State College, our local community college. And so, and specifically, I work as a manager for academic advising, and so I oversee academic advising and student orientation at our Lake Worth campus, which is our largest central campus. And so, our institution has had a relationship with FAU for a very long time. You know, folks can speak to the idea that potentially we've served as a feeder institution, we have relationships to that effect, right? However, interestingly enough, FAU has changed its practices over the last several years in an attempt to become a more selective Tier 1 research institution. They have changed the parameters by which transfer students from the community college can access their ability to transfer here. So minimum GPA has gone up.
Yep.
Institutionally, minimum GPAs across specific programs and colleges have gone up. Transfer students from a nursing program are no longer allowed at FAU. You know, and so, again, I get it. You know, I understand institutions need to do what they need to do to be able to position themselves in the best way possible. But in making those decisions, I'm not even entirely sure that they understand what they've done to uphold the challenges that we see with these practices, because we know for a fact, time and time again, who the students are that are not benefiting from this or they're being hurt by these practices. These are students that we're speaking to right now who do not have the ability, resources, and beyond just access, support to be successful long term. Most of our students don't even successfully transition from the community college to the four-year institution, let alone those individuals who are trying to get into more selective institutions.
Right. One of the core ways institutions uphold white supremacy is admissions practices.
Yes.
One of the best ways, that's the easiest thing to identify. Easy, like just whoop, whoop, right? Like increase your admissions requirements, you're going to decrease your students of color. Classic example, University of California system. All right. In 1996, affirmative action, Proposition 209 did away with affirmative action. The number of Black and Latino students who have gotten into the UC system have decreased every year since, 20 years. And not only getting in, but applying. So Latino students and Black students don't even think they'll get in, so why would they apply? Right? And that's the reality of admissions, right? Your minoritized students, why would they apply to the institution they can't get into? They're like, I can't get in there. I don't know anybody that's ever gone there. I don't even know what an SAT. I don't know any of these things, right? Like, how in the heck am I going to get in? So they don't even apply. So the number of applications and the number of enrolled students of color in the UC system has gone down every year since the elimination of affirmative action. So data, we got solid data to show it's true, right? So change your admissions practices, change what you're doing, and you will decrease your students of color for sure. Right? Now the flip side is, so you become more broad access and you admit more students of color and you admit more minoritized students, yeah, you gotta work harder to support them because remember, they've been excluded their entire lives. Right? So an institution has to do more. So I'm like arguing constantly, like, so we're asking HSIs to do more with less. Right? These are minoritized institutions. We're asking them to do more because they have to serve the minoritized students who have been minoritized, who have been oppressed, who have been left out all this time, and now they got to do more. Right? HSIs are working hard. Why are we criticizing them so much? It's hard to do this work. It's hard to serve minoritized students, right?
I have a question about these practices. If you are an HSI and you internally are pushing to become a research one, and then your admissions decline in terms of, and you go down by 25%, do you lose that?
You can apply. Yeah, you can apply for the designation. Yeah.
So you can actually do you know any institutions that have lost their designation?
Yes. Yeah. Because you have to like apply in order, and all that it means is then you're no longer eligible for federal funding, right? That's the reality. Is to be an HSI means you're eligible for federal funding. That's what it is. So if you drop in your admissions, yes. If you go down to 24%, you're no longer eligible for the federal funding. Yes.
So is the designation an appropriation in and of itself?
Yes, it is, absolutely. And so people argue that like institutions become HSI so they can appropriate the Latinx culture, right? That's definitely an argument as well, right? I go back and forth on that one. I'm like, I get that because institutions want to be excellent, and being diverse now is seen as excellent. Right? So bringing up your Latino number. And here's the reality. There's a whole lot of smart Latinx students who can get into your institution. So institutions figure out how to find those students, right? There's plenty of smart Latino students, right? So they'll find them and they'll figure them out, but then we're not serving the whole population. And reality is, like I said, those students that aren't quote unquote smart enough, it's just on paper because they've been through K-12 system that has minoritized them, right? They're smart enough too. right? They just didn't go to the schools that y'all are recruiting from or whatever it may be, right? It's all systemic, it's all connected to the way we keep folks down.
I mean, it's not about being smart enough. It's also about the cultural barriers and the economic barriers. So even if they are smart enough, there are all these other barriers that keep people out.
Right.
That are never acknowledged.
Right. And I use that term smart enough, kind of like loosely. A good book to read about that is Alexander Aston wrote, Are You Smart Enough? And he attacks all the ways in which institutions of higher ed uphold prestige because we value smartness. All institutions value smartness. Smart students as defined by test scores, and smart faculty as defined by those who get big research dollars. Those are the things institutions value. Smartness. Right? And so, yeah, we're all smart enough, but like, do you fit into those categories where you can get those things, right? Do we know how to act wide enough to pass the test and get the research dollars?
I have a question. I'm learning more about HSIs. I don't know about other communities. Are there other communities like this for other populations? Like Hispanic serving institutions? Are for
Historically,
Black colleges, HBCUs, what else?
Tribal colleges and universities.
So those are the only three?
Asian Pacific Islander serving, AP, they're called ANAPCs. Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native American serving institutions, they all came together in this ANAPC designation. ANAPC designation came about in 2008. HSI designation came out about in 1992. Tribal colleges and universities are historical, as are HBCUs. So they're different, and it's hard to compare them.
Yeah, that's what I'm
It's
trying
very
to
different. The most comparable to HSIs is the ANAPCs, but ANAPCs are less. But you find ANAPCs in places where there's large Asian and Pacific Islander populations. There's a good handful in California, Chicago, and like Hawaii, right, like Guam.
And a follow-up question to that, you keep talking about federal funding. How do you think that would change the next, maybe potential 2 or 6 years with our current situation?
Oh
Yeah.
gosh, I try not to think about it. I try to just hope we're flying under the radar, right? Because the current administration is just attacking different things all the time, and then they just shut down altogether. We see where that's going, idiots. And so so far, minority serving institutions have sort of flown under the radar, and that's all I can hope for. Because believe me, they'll come for the minority serving institutions, and the funding matters. It matters to institutions that need the resources. There's a lot of HSIs that need resources, right? So the funding does matter. For the most part, we've sort of flown under the radar. That's all I could say is just hope, right? Which is sad. That's where we're at with this administration. Is you hope your group or the group you care about and are advocating for just flies under the radar, right? Because it's one group at a time. Keep attacking one group at a time, right? And the rest of us are like, oh God, they're coming for me or the people I care about the most, right? Which I'm advocating for, right? Because you don't have to be a part of that group to advocate for that group, right? That's reality. That's part of that critical consciousness is that we all fight for each other, right? Because we understand the struggles of everybody, whether we're in that group or not. So, I don't know, I guess it's to be seen. I just daily, I'm like, I can't believe that this clown show's going on. It's still going on. So, assumption, did I already say this one? Yeah. Curricula, pedagogy, and practices have been used to call it tools of colonization, right? So I've been writing about decolonization of HSIs, right? I've wrote an article about that, so it got me thinking about like, well, what does colonization look like, right? That curriculum and practices, educational practices, have always been intended to, quote unquote, Americanize folks. Always, historically. Natives, that was, right? Like bring the natives in and quote unquote Americanize and or Christianize. That was a big thing, big movement, right? Like being colonized meant being Christianized, right? That you strip you of your language, your culture, your ways of knowing, and your religion, most importantly, because all the other religions are horrible except Christianity, right? Because we're in the U.S., right? So the U.S. is a Christian-dominated society. So Americanized and acculturate, right? So that's what the curriculum is intended to do. So when you look at your curricular practices and your practices on campus, think about that. Are we trying to Americanize people, right? Is that what we're trying to do? Strip them of their ways of knowing. Used to deny Latinos access to power and knowledge, maintain legacy of white hegemony and supremacy, and also ways to invalidate indigenous epistemological paradigms and ways of knowing. Right, so that's what curriculum does. It tries to minimize other ways of knowing. Other assumption is that the practices are not racially, culturally, that they are ethnically, racially, culturally neutral. This is where I bring in the STEM example, right? That we assume it's neutral. Math is neutral, right? It's taught from the same perspective. No, it's not, right? Even what you say down to the core in the classroom is not neutral. None of us are neutral. We are not neutral. We all have our own ways of knowing. There's no way that we can be neutral, right? So we have to think about our own self. and how we're supporting students and educating students in a way that is through our lens and not theirs, right? Because the reality is, if we really want to effectively serve them, we have to see it through their lens, right? Nothing is neutral. Don't let anybody tell you it's neutral. It's not. Nothing is neutral. Let's see how much, I got 23 minutes. Let's get into curricula a little bit. So somebody asked about approaches, right? So I like this model by James Banks. Up here's the citation. And it really helped me. I did this so I teach the politics and history of higher education, right? And I took the history of higher education, and it was taught from a white male perspective, right? And I had the worst experience. It was the worst quarter of my PhD program. I was like, God. But the minoritized people got 1 week. That's usually what happens, right? You get 1 week. And y'all laugh because you know you've seen that syllabus, right? You get the 1 week, right? So everybody, that week, women, people of color, black, we were all in the 1 week, right? 1 week. And it was a quarter system, so the other 9 weeks were the white male perspective. But we got our week, right? So how does that make folks feel? Makes us feel minoritized and silenced, right? And guess what? You can't fit all minoritized groups into 1 week. There's no way, right? So there's different approaches, right? And so the contributions approach is where the curricula is unchanged except for inclusion of like heroes or cultural artifacts, right? So we celebrate that one person, right? We could probably go culture by culture, race by race, and say, who's the one person? Martin Luther King, right? Okay, we talked about Martin Luther King. All right, cool, we're done. K-12 schools do this too, right? I'm like, can't we do somebody else? Why is that? I mean, yes, okay, important. But let's talk about like some other folks, right? Like, why is it only one? Every group gets one hero, right? So that's what that is. You get your one hero, right? The next one is the additive approach, where you start to add some concepts or themes. That's really that week. That's the week, right? Yeah, I put a week of the minoritized voices. I did my due diligence, right? Transformative is where you start to fundamentally change the goals and structures and the perspectives. And then the social action approach, I like this because he actually talks about students making decisions about topics. And I think this is good for those of you that are student services and the curriculum, because how do you, and I said this already, right? How do you bring your students into the conversation? Your students need to tell you what kind of practices they need. Your students need to tell you what kind of curriculum they want, right? And so a really progressive syllabus allows for that flexibility, right? It actually allows students to decide what the topics are going to be, right? Or it gets feedback, right? I just saw a post on like a listserv that I'm on. The person posted, you know what, I'm doing this class and it's a feminist class and there's a lot of, I had these different perspectives going on, and I got feedback halfway through the semester, and the feedback was that there were no Asian voices or Asian American voices. And this person who, is a self-proclaimed person who is woke or conscious or whatever you're going to call him, and had all these different ways of knowing in this class on feminism, completely was silenced a group. And I bet you there's other groups silenced, right? And the students told that person that. And so that person came to listen and was like, help! I want to add these voices, what can I do? And so everybody starts posting, it's like a really progressive group. So we had lots of ideas of how to add this group, and that person went back and now has changed the curriculum, right? It's like, okay, scratch what we're going to do this couple days, we're adding these different perspectives. That's a progressive syllabus, right? That you are able to have the flexibility, right? And say like, okay, I got student feedback, and the minoritized students in the classroom told me that I'm missing these, right? Your class is full of minoritized students, let them tell you, right? The program, same thing, your programs that you're serving, stop assuming they want whatever food and culture night, and ask them what they want, right? Ask them what kind of services that they need, right? Like I said, ask them where they feel most comfortable, and they'll tell you it's the cleaning lady. But until you ask them, they're not gonna tell you. They won't tell you. I think that was really like eye-awakening for the administrators who were in the room when I asked that, and they started talking about the cleaning lady. They were just like, whoa, right? And I was like, y'all are doing all these things, putting all these money into programs, and these students feel comfortable with the cleaning lady. Y'all need to rethink what you're doing, right? Ask the students. Why did I ask them? I'm only here for a day. Why didn't you ask them, right? So that's that social action approach. I like that. And all of you can use it, no matter what part of the university you're at. Talk to students. Ask them what they need, right? Ask them what they want. There's lots of, if you're thinking about, changing your pedagogy, your curricular approach, there's lots of different ways. People have written about anti-racist pedagogy, transformative, social justice, culturally relevant. So if you're gonna do a search all these terms, right? There's lots of different ways to think about it. I like anti-racism. Because like I said, nobody ever admits they're racist. So when you're speaking about anti-racism, you're actually thinking about disrupting white supremacy, right? But we could say anti-whatever, right? There's all kinds of other groups that we are. Anti-oppressive, really, right? Because we're oppressive in many ways and for all social groups, not just race. So there's lots of different terms. So as you start to do a search, look at all the terms. I liked earlier that we talked a little bit about books because I knew I had the slide. There's so many books I could have put up here. These are some of my favorites, right? But it's like even just putting a book, right? Changing a book, thinking about knowledge differently from different perspectives, right? Because the reality is there are students that come to campus and have never read a book by someone like them, right? And like I said, that's our bad as a K through 12 system, right? So how do we change that at the university level? How do we start to disrupt that at the university level, right? And it's hard, it's challenging, it's hard. When I showed this on a slide before, a lot of people were like, tell me about this book. I'm like, this book is amazing, read this book. So yeah, read that book, The Dirty Girl Social Club, right? But these are just books that were written by folks, and this was specifically a class I was talking about how to center Latino student voices, and so these are all Latinx authors. So some of the examples of culturally relevant curricula on campuses, like I said, it's mostly ethnic studies programs, right? Like that's where pretty much all the centering is going on. I think I have a slide on here somewhere I want y'all to think about it. Yeah, let's do this. This was just an example. If you want to read this article I wrote, I talk about how the Chicano Studies Department at the institution that I did research with, how they center Chicano studies. And they did in a really important way. That's the citation. But the Chicano Studies Department, they normalized it on campus to a way that, I mean, almost every student I talked to on that campus had taken at least one Chicano Studies course. No matter what they were. It didn't matter what their racial background was. Black students, Asian students, white students, everybody was like, yeah, I took that class. I took the Chicano Studies class. Because it was so normal. That's what you do, right? And you could also get your general education requirements out of ethnic studies, not just Chicano Studies, ethnic studies, right? So you gotta give students a reason and incentivize them to take these courses. If this is where you're gonna offer the ethnocentricity, you gotta give them an incentive to actually take those courses, right? If it doesn't count towards their degree, guess what? They're not taking it, right? So you gotta change the policies. Gotta change the policies on what's guiding. So real quickly, I want you to think, you can think in your mind, meditate on it, write down on it. Where are those ethnocentric courses here on your campus that you know of? And it might be people, a lot of times it's people, like so-and-so does it over in such and such department, or the whole department does it. Mm-hmm. No, they're historically, so HBCUs are.
I'm more asking, is there any schools that can become a certain HSI percentage?
You mean?
Like, I'm trying, no, just
Another group?
Yeah,
Like Muslim serving institution or something?
that's what I'm asking.
Could other populations become a serving, right? Could you have like a Muslim serving institution? You could, but the reality is these institutions, people fought for the HSI designation. The federal government didn't decide there was going to be HSIs. This was a historical struggle, like 20-year struggle of people advocating and going to the federal government and begging and asking and pleading for this designation because institutional leaders needed support for their institutions because the students, we knew statistically that Latino students were not going to make it once they got to post-secondary. They were not likely to graduate. So these leaders came and were like, hey, we need help. So yeah, other groups could definitely, advocate for it. So real quick, where are these ethnocentric spots on your campus? Like I said, it might be a person. A lot of times the person's in the room. They're like, oh, I do that. But anywhere?
I'm in the anthropology department and we offer some, like, we have a woman who's from Ecuador and she offers some sort of South American history, yeah. I'm not sure what the curriculum is, I've never sat in the class. But as an anthropology faculty member, I know we have some. Yeah.
So I think that's a good example, but I also want to challenge you to think about international versus domestic, because that's important too, right? So like ethnic studies programs, all those lists, those are all domestic sort of ideas, right? When I got to the University of Pittsburgh, people were like, oh, go visit the Latin American Studies Department, Gina, go, because I'm like the only Latina in the whole, everywhere, the whole school. And I'm like, but I don't study Latin America, right? And so I looked into the Latin American Studies Department, and they study Latin America. And I'm like, I study U.S. domestic Latino things, right? Domestic born Latinos and domestic Latinos that's different. That's different than studying Latin America, right? So keep that in mind, right? That like when you think about these ethnocentric centers, that like, there's differences, right? So offering a globalization class, I get that in business all the time. We offer globalization in business. I'm like, yeah, but do you like disrupt anything going on here in the US, right? Like the white supremacy that happens when you send your students out into the big 4 accounting firms, right? You talk about that and they're like crickets, right? No, when we talk about globalization, okay, cool, I'm not saying you don't do that, right? But you gotta, it's complicated, right? And centering experiences, it's complicated.
In environmental studies, look with the Everglades. There's a lot of the Native American people with the Everglades, and there's some courses in that.
Okay.
So that's
Other spots where there's some pockets around here?
Yeah, I'm gonna brag on my department. So
Okay,
4 undergraduate courses in multicultural global studies.
okay. What department is it?
Curriculum, culture, and educational inquiry.
I'm gonna brag on my department, okay? But even just the name, right? Like that's you would expect that to be.
Right.
Okay.
So, and yeah, we host the TESOL bilingual program.
Right.
We have multicultural and areas of concentration, 5 courses at the master's level.
Right.
Online, you can do it.
Right.
And we have at the doctoral level a critical methodologies class, which is required for all of our doctoral students.
Right.
So they get into the epistemological
Good.
issues
Yes.
of what is it, and everyone goes, there's race-based in methodology?
Yes. Yes. Methodology is non-neutral.
And-
Research
and
is non-neutral. Yeah.
So,
No.
and I think this, and even though I mentioned courses, this idea pervades the entire department. We have a social justice focused mission
Right.
at the department, so
Yeah.
it's upfront and it's clear,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I think that's important.
Yeah. So there's a couple in anthropology and a couple in one area of the School of Education. You're just one program. I assume there's
One
one program.
department.
One department in the School of Ed, so there's other departments.
But there are other departments that are doing.
There's other, okay,
research, yeah.
okay. I'm just
Yeah.
noting the level to which things happen in a very minute way.
But it's
So,
more than one course now, so it's,
yeah,
we're getting
okay.
programmatic, we're getting
Okay.
departmental, and there's also then the affiliation, how
Okay.
you're networked across the campus,
Okay,
right? So-
right. Any other places where they're offering ethnocentric?
I'm trying
Curriculum?
to think, for me, like, speaking with the student affairs side, speaking as a student, I know my race class and gender was definitely one big class that I
Okay.
had in the college of ed. And in reference to.
College of Ed. College of Ed is progressive,
That's us.
okay?
That's us, that's given it.
That's normal.
Like but to get like a brown basic 101, because sometimes we can understand what we know from our experiences, but to understand the whole big picture of other race, genders that have been oppressed. We talk about oppression, but we also talk about how that oppression affects different systems and how you are able as a change agent to move forward to be able to support students and be able to support those people that you want to be able to help out your community. For me, it was helpful for me because it gave me a good framework to work with in the class and to understand more. Because I identify as a gay Latino male, but then I also identify like there's other pressures going on that me as a gay Latino may be kind of shielded from.
Right.
So to understand it was definitely a big step for me to
Right.
understand that a little better. In student affairs, speaking on my department, I work for diversity and multicultural affairs. And going back to that cookie discussion that we were just discussing earlier, we done something a little bit called flavors of diversity. People would think flavors of diversity, different foods from different cultures, but there's an educational component behind it. So we are able to, from time to time, bring faculty to come in to discuss the different foods and how their influences in the regions and how the simple foods that we eat are influenced here in this country, but what are the roots and how is it beneficial to understand the importance of that.
Yeah.
So speaking of both,
There's okay.
education portion.
Was there another place with the curriculum?
I work for
We're
the
gonna use
Center for
services.
Global Engagement, and we're part of academic affairs as well as student affairs. So we partner with Peace, Justice, and Human Rights, with CAPS, which is Counseling and Psychology Services, as well as ODMA, Diversity and Multicultural Affairs. So we offer programs for students. We like to have them outside, because a lot of times students, unless it is a time that works for them, because of their class or because of work, they have an opportunity to have these cultural experiences too. So for example, with Peace Stories, where students had an opportunity to read about what peace means to them, depending on where you're from, what you live, peace and safety means something different. So when they have the opportunity to read the boards, we still have them them. So I think it's important to also meet students where they are.
Yeah.
So either it's from between classes or running to campus, so that they can also have experiences and getting out of the comfort zone too.
Okay, so we named like 4. How many areas are on this campus? How many programs, departments do we think we have? This is a large university. This is a large university. So if I tell you to name where it's not happening, it's probably y'all could name, because y'all are having trouble naming where it is happening. Where is it not happening? You said sociology is not
The
happening?
sociology would be one that I would assume that they have, and gender studies as well. would
So you
have.
assume, you're not really sure.
Well, I
No,
know
no,
for sure.
I mean, you
Yeah,
can
yeah.
speak to it, but I know when you
Yeah.
advise students, you send them to allied places.
And the one person, right? Like again, being kind of facetious, but like the one person, right? They do that to me, believe me. Go take Gina's class. Really? Because I was like 100 other faculty in the whole school. And I'm the only one, right? Like that's what happens. It's like the one person that does it, right? Because they bring their ways of knowing to sociology. They bring it to psychology. They bring it to anthropology. They bring it to law, right? Like you got the one.
I think there's a little bit more than that. I mean, for instance, in the anthropology department, I know there's a study abroad program to Ecuador.
Again, study abroad.
Right.
Again, study abroad, right? Like I said, I'm just cautioning you against understanding that sending people internationally, important. Yes, do it. But what are you doing to think about the systems of oppression and teaching that in your classroom of the students that are on your campus that have never left the U.S. and might never leave the U.S. and only know the U.S. and, whatever, right? Like disrupting that and getting them to think about their experiences.
Yeah, so I'm an academic advisor with University Advising Services, and the perspective that we hear is very interesting because they come back and tell us what their experiences have been in these classes, and I always make it a point to ask because I like to know when advising other students, because we advise them based off of things that they're interested in, so they have the opportunity to take classes from the anthropology department and the sociology department as examples among many others. And so it's interesting to come back and hear their experience because in my advising experience, I concur that it's always that one professor that I'll hear like, oh, so-and-so is very good. And so one that I can speak to is social problems where the students will come back and they're really being educated about the different experiences amongst different groups. And so they're being taught to think critically about these different populations, and that's something that's exciting for them. So I say that as an encouragement, when you are putting together syllabus and curriculum that the students do appreciate that, and then they share those experiences, not only with us as staff, but also with other students.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
But what I'm hearing here is that one thing that maybe that you can do is have, find out for the curriculum, what are some of the classes that are addressing those issues, because I think folks here can speak about their own departments, but we don't know what the other departments are doing.
Right.
So if we have a better sense of, even if we know who that person is in those different departments, that would be helpful.
Right. Yeah, because that's what you have now, right? So almost doing like an assessment, right? Of like, okay, where are all the places? Good, let's make that list so we know where in the curriculum there is this ethnocentric ideas, right? Good, that's good. But then I encourage you to look at the exclusion. Let's look at the much longer list of where it is not happening. That's the disruption. That's where the disruption towards HSI status is going to happen. You're like, good, I'm glad we have these. Now, how do we make all of these ethnocentric? How do we center minoritized ways of knowing in all these other areas, right? And that's a complicated long-term plan, right? That's gonna start to get into like long-term strategic planning to how to disrupt that. Part of that is bringing in people that have those ways of knowing in those areas, right? And that's complicated on how folks are hired in this university and all universities, right? In ways that uphold white supremacy, right? And heteronormative ways of knowing, hegemonic ways of knowing, right? So that's going to be the more important assessment of like all these that aren't doing it. Here and then here and here.
That's actually already happening with the Diversity Council. That's what we're working on.
Okay, of the ones that are excluded or the included?
Both. We're working on both. And for my college, CDSI, College for Defense Social Equity, there are individual courses that do address gender, ethnicity, and everything that we're talking about. But it's not formalized.
Yeah.
It's pretty much in the elective area.
Yeah.
So that's something that we're working to bring forward.
Right.
And it's a work in progress, but we're most definitely doing it here at FAU.
Good. No, it's important. Do you have a diversity requirement to graduate? No diversity requirement. That's also very common at universities, right? Like that there's not even a requirement to take a class from a different perspective. Because you can't have the requirement until you know that the classes are there. Because otherwise, all your students are gonna be taking the 10 classes you have, I'm just saying 10, maybe it's 20, 30, I don't know, right? But like, the diversity requirement, that's huge. When a university passes the diversity requirement, and that has to come from the faculty. That comes from the Senate. That comes from there. That happens nowhere else. Why? Because faculty control the curriculum. Faculty decide what students need to graduate. And that has to happen, right? That we have to require. Some institutions I've seen in California, I talk about California a lot because they're progressive, have two diversity requirements in order to graduate, right? But that's really super progressive. And it says, 2018, how do universities not require you to take some sort of diverse perspective? And that's usually loosely defined. You can take a religious studies class, a gender class, right? It's very loosely defined. But you gotta take something from a different perspective, right? When there's a diversity requirement.
Yeah, just a little bit of curriculum. I think what, in terms of, building up the infrastructure, but when faculty are, constantly filling in reports and we have to report our spot exams, I tried a transformative, syllabus and it bombed.
Yeah.
Like the students gave me so much pushback, my spot scores were the worst ever.
Yeah.
And they said, we wanted a lecture, we want multiple choice
Yep.
exams, we don't want to write, we want to be able to use our cell phones in class, we want to be able to tune out, and we want a lecture, because then we don't have to.
Because they've been colonized.
Yes.
Colonized curriculum, y'all.
So it's like
I get that too. Why don't you lecture more? What? I'm trying to have got group discussions, I got this, that, all this sort of thing. That's hard work. And you want me to stand up and lecture? I can stand up and lecture for 2.5 hours. I can't. I don't because it's not good pedagogy.
Yeah, so right.
Right? It's not engaging pedagogy, but they ask. All of
So
them. Why don't you
I think
lecture more? We came to hear you.
We need support, it needs to come from the faculty senate, we need to know who are the other faculty on campus who are trying. I got it from my husband, who's a high school teacher who does a flipped classroom. I didn't get it from my peers.
Right, yeah.
At all, I don't get it at the college.
Yeah, the college level.
I get it from the K through 12.
Right. But yeah, you see how faculty are there's a lot of pushback. When faculty do this stuff, they're like, yeah, I'm gonna do it and all stuff. And then they get pushed back and then they just go back to the ways,
Yeah,
the dominant ways anyway. Because otherwise, I'm just gonna get tired. I'm gonna burn out, right? So what about programs and services? Since we're clearly running out of time, any programs and services on campus? You have multicultural centers, like Greek organizations that center Latinx students or minoritized students. Tell me. Come on. Y'all said you were the student services
Gina, I
folks.
think you named it early in your
I named
presentation.
them. There was like 4.
Only 2 Greek organizations and then 4 student organizations. I'm not really familiar with them. The faculty said should be more engaged. And once again, I was tapping to, you need to be this and everything, right?
Yeah.
One of the only Latinos, I have some of my other colleagues here. But I think there's a need of that, right? I mean, we have the Urban Mill Initiative, but even then, they struggle to recruit female men.
Right.
Right? Or, but it's the same challenge that we see in other universities. How many universities call me, like you said, oh, we need to create a men of color initiative. And they call me, but like, I'm not the expert on that in your campus, right? You're the expert in campus. But I think the challenge is how do we reproduce and who is running these organizations and how, I mean, I think about, as a critique for that Urban Mill Initiative at Florida Atlantic University, it is that they come like, oh, we need to recruit more Latino men. Well, who is in that table making decisions? It's usually more black men, right? And nothing wrong with that, but it's more the idea of like, what is the mission and who are you targeting? Thinking of all of my other, I mean, I know we have a lot of other Latinos in campus, but they're not invited in this conversation. The terminology that is used is not inclusive for these communities. It's not necessarily all men of color, right? But also I think I want to go back really quick to this, because I teach higher education, and I try to, we really work in my class and so on, and other of our scholars in different ways of knowing. And every semester I get the same responses. This should have been a social justice class. This should be, like this class is, last semester I got a student that said, this class is making, the books that I use in class are racist.
Right.
Right, like how, where. Right? We need to understand the history of higher education, who was it for. And then we engage them in different activities and so on, and they still struggle with that, like, well, yeah.
And a lot of those students come around eventually. Believe me, I get them like years later,
yeah.
like, you changed my life, right? You changed my life. But at the time, it's hard to evolve. It's hard to grow as a person. It's hard to develop. That's painful, right? We've all been there. We've all developed, and we push back at the time, right? And so I do it because I know it's good for me, right? Real quick on the services. Okay, y'all got like what, like 8,000 Latino students or something on this campus? I mean, you got a lot of students. Where do they hang out? Where do they go? This is a serious question. Where in the heck are they? Right now, where are they? Where?
Somewhere in the
Somewhere in the union?
Some play,
Ping pong.
Dominoes,
Ping
ping
pong,
pong,
thank you.
okay, ping
Some
pong,
play ping
okay.
Library,
Some play
The library, okay.
But
Where else, where else?
I think it's hard because I think going back to what Dr. Selena said is that we are in that half residential, half commuter. So a lot of our Latino students being from South Florida and having that strong family values of you want to work to support the family or I need to babysit your brothers and sisters are going to come to campus, do the classing, and then go home.
Right, right.
So I think why we only have X number of Latino groups on campus is because these students are, my family's calling me, I'm out this week.
Right.
Kind of thing. So I think oftentimes that we ask, where's the post of Latino kids on campus? And figuring out, well, I see them, but I don't know how they might recognize themselves because although they may not be involved in a Latino fraternity sorority, the membership of the typical white fraternity sororities are Latino.
Right, that's what happens at HSI.
And it very much
That happens at HSI. So the dominant group becomes the Latino group because your groups start to reflect the population. So that's the reality, right? Like you're gonna have, if you have 25%, you're gonna have 25% probably in lots of these different places. But I put that out there because I want y'all to think about like, where are your students, right? And so yes, you're a commuter campus. Yes, not all students want to engage, but there are a lot that do, but haven't found their space, right? And that's going to be your job as you move forward. How do you create those culturally relevant spaces or those inclusive spaces or those anti-racist spaces, right? How do you get them engaged in ways that even the commuter student can get engaged, right? I wrote this paper about civic engagement for Latino students, and I found all this literature online, and it was for an emerging HSI, right? Me and my friend, we looked at, my scholar friend, we looked at different indicators of civic engagement for students at emerging HSIs. And part of the problem was what we found was that the way civic engagement has been defined was along normative practices, right? So when a student fills out a survey about whether or not they're engaged civically, they're asked if they voted, if they volunteered in a political campaign, or they did calls, I don't know, some voting calls, right? Or they volunteered at a homeless shelter, right? These really normative ways, right? And I'm like, but Latino students engage in all these other ways, right? They do, right? But we're not documenting that, right? So we have to redefine how we're defining these normative ways of being, right? Engagement, that's what we do on college campuses. We're all about engagement, right? The research shows high impact practices engage students and those lead to high retention. George Koo's work, we've been knowing that from higher ed, except those practices are based on normative ways of knowing. What do Latinos do what is civic engagement? Throw anything out. What do Latinos do that looks like civic engagement that isn't voting? Church. What do? Go to church. Who said that? Church, right? They're engaged in their church. They're interpreting for their parents, right? Or their communities, because their community needs interpretation. They're helping undocumented students figure out how to apply for college. I mean, all these different things, right? What else? Any other?
Hurricane relief.
All kinds of things.
All the hurricane relief work for Puerto Rico, this, that, I mean, that's.
Hurricane relief, right? They're standing out there collecting money. They're selling whatever to collect money to send to Puerto Rico, right? That's not documented on our little survey. So we're like, well, look at Latino students, they're not engaged because they're non-traditional. And they had to go home and they had to babysit their brother and blah, blah, blah. Really? Because they were. We just didn't ask them in the right ways. We didn't ask them what it is that engages them, right? We need to figure out what is it that is engaging them before we can offer those opportunities to them, right? We have to define our structure. We have to define our constructs. And I use civic engagement because it's an outcome that institutions of higher ed, we value civic engagement. Institutions of higher ed traditionally have valued civic engagement. We believe that people who graduate from institutions of higher ed are engaged in much higher levels civically, right? But what does civic engagement mean for minoritized populations?
Talking about that engagement, since we do understand Latinos do engage, when they come into the higher education environment, going back to that example of the cleaning lady as a young student,
Yeah.
I do believe that it is within us to empower that student to engage with a philosophy teacher.
Right.
Not to just isolate themselves and talk to the cleaning lady about what may be in their mind, because in reality, they're looking for an answer from that philosophy teacher regarding that class.
Right.
So it's important for us to empower them in that engagement with the institution.
Right.
I don't think the institution is only responsible for engaging the student. The student themselves have to engage with the institution if they want to be successful.
Right.
That negates potential cultural values. And respectfully, I think it's true. I think we should empower students to be able to do that. but I think it doesn't take into account culturally what students have been taught to do, right? There's a power imbalance between a professor and a student normally across the cross-section of students, regardless of race, gender, or anything of that matter. And so as Latino students in general are culturally taught to defer to elders, to not question, to believe in the familial core, they're not going to engage a professor who is not like them, who doesn't know them. And on top of that, they're also taught, and studies have shown this, they're taught to keep problems within the home. So they're not going to take problems to someone that they don't know and they don't trust. It's why they don't go to academic advising. It's why they don't seek student services. It's why they peer advise themselves and make all types of messed up decisions, unfortunately, right? And so while in an ideal world, we'd be able to create an opportunity for them to be able to do that, and I would love to see that as a higher education professional, I think we have to recognize the inherent cultural challenges that will not let us do that.
Right.
Right,
And that's this whole idea of
understandable.
centering the ways of knowing of Latino students or whatever students you're trying to serve, right? That like we all interact and operate differently, right? And it doesn't align with the way universities operate.
Well, that's what we have to disrupt.
That
That's
like
what
you have to
disruption
raise
does.
your hand and ask the question and go to office hours. Like I agree, like you know, how many people actually go to office hours? We know, none, right? For a whole bunch of reasons, but some of them are cultural, right? How do you flip that? How do you flip office hours in a way that yes, it is the university's responsibility. HSIs, it is the faculty's responsibility to engage with students. To go sit on the lawn, okay, wherever the Latino students are sitting right now, they're playing dominoes, faculty need to go to them. Faculty need to go sit and, okay, I'm gonna play dominoes with you. How about that, right? Because they're not gonna come to me if I sit in my ivory white tower, right? Faculty can't do that. That's not being an HSI. We can't operate like we always have. It's not working. The numbers show that. Latino students are not graduating in equitable numbers across the board. Black students are not. Black students are even lower than Latino students across the board. We're not doing a good job of that either. Native American students, not doing a good job. Because we need to disrupt. We need to shift the way we operate. So that's what the whole presentation was about. I love y'all. Y'all were great. Thank you very much. With the evaluations. Feel free to reach out to me. I only got to like not even half of this, so I can send you the prezi. But feel free to reach out. My contact information, I think, was somewhere. I don't know.